Lenore Taverner was 33 years old, widowed by the sea and orphaned by grief, cast out of her family home by a man named Silas Hobart, who had swallowed her father's shipping business whole through a web of falsified debts and crooked harbor fees. She had $60 to her name, folded into the lining of her late mother's coat, and she spent $45 of it at the Caromere County auction on a crumbling lighthouse at the end of Gallows Point, a tower so battered by salt wind and years of abandonment that the auctioneer offered an apology before bringing down the gavel. The people of Caromere laughed openly and called her a fool to her face. But Lenore had noticed the way the spiral staircase wall did not quite match the rest of the tower, the place where the mortar was newer and deliberately uneven, as though someone had sealed something inside and trusted that the right person would one day find it. What lay behind that wall would not only change her life, it would restore a town that had been quietly dying for 20 years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Lenore Taverner. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments, we read every single one. Caromere sat on the ragged eastern edge of the Maine coast, a town built on granite and salt, where the fog came in like a living thing and the tides ruled the hours of every man, woman, and child who called the place home. It had been a good town once, a town of sturdy houses and proud vessels, of fishermen who knew the water the way a farmer knows his fields, by feel, by instinct, by the kind of knowledge that could not be taught in any schoolroom but only earned through years of cold mornings and close calls. The harbor at Caromere was sheltered by a long, hooking point of rock that curved into the sea like a protective arm, and at the very tip of that point stood the Gallows Point Lighthouse, a tower of granite blocks and iron railings that had guided ships safely past the treacherous shoals for nearly 70 years. Every child in Caromere grew up knowing the rhythm of its light, the slow, steady sweep across the water at night, the way it made the fog glow like a lantern held close to the face of the dark. Lenore Taverner was born in a house on Harbor Street, a narrow clapboard place with a view of the water from every window, and she came into the world already surrounded by the sea. Her father, Captain Augustine Taverner, was a coastal shipping man who ran a modest fleet of 3 schooners carrying freight between Caromere and the ports to the south, Portland, Portsmouth, Gloucester. He was not a rich man, but he was a respected one, known for paying his crew fairly and for never leaving port without a full inspection of his rigging, a habit born of having seen too many careless captains lose good men to preventable disasters. Her mother, Della Taverner, had been born a Marsh, daughter of a Boston cartographer who had mapped harbors and coastlines for the Coast and Geodetic Survey before his eyes failed him. Della had inherited her father's precision, his love of charts and instruments, his quiet conviction that the world could be understood if you looked at it closely enough and measured it carefully enough. She taught Lenore to read nautical charts before she could read novels, to understand the meaning of every symbol and depth marking, to draw a coastline freehand from memory and get the curves right. It was Della who taught Lenore the thing that would matter most in the years to come, that the smallest details, the tiny discrepancies that most people walked past without a second glance, were always where the truth lived. The Taverner household was not a loud one. Augustine spoke softly and meant what he said. Della spoke even more softly and meant it even more. Lenore grew up in the space between them, learning that strength did not require volume, that patience was not the same as passivity, and that the people who lasted in this world were the ones who paid attention while everyone else was busy making noise. She spent her childhood afternoons at the lighthouse, where the keeper, a lean, weathered man named Ezra Caulfield, let her sit in the watchroom and look through the lens while he told her stories about the ships he had guided and the storms he had weathered. Caulfield had been the keeper at Gallows Point for 30 years, and he carried the light the way a priest carries a calling, with devotion, with vigilance, with the understanding that the work he did was not for himself but for every soul on the water who depended on that sweep of light to find their way home. Lenore admired him. She admired the way he polished the Fresnel lens every morning, the way he kept the clockwork mechanism wound and oiled, the way he recorded the weather and the shipping traffic in his logbook with a steadiness that made the lighthouse feel less like a building and more like a beating heart. At 18, Lenore married a young fisherman named Corwin Hale, a quiet man with steady hands and a good heart who worked the waters east of the point in a lobster boat he had built himself. They were married for 3 years before a November storm took him and his boat and left nothing behind but a piece of hull washed up on the rocks south of the harbor. Lenore did not break. She had been raised by people who understood that the sea gave and the sea took, and she folded her grief into the same place she folded everything else, deep, private, held, and she kept working, kept reading charts, kept watching the water the way her mother had taught her, with the patient, attentive eye that misses nothing. The trouble began with a man named Silas Hobart, who arrived in Caramere in the spring of 1876 with a satchel of money, a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a plan. He was from Portland, and he had done well there, too well, some said, for a man of his age, and he had come to Caramere because he saw what the town had and what it did not yet know it was losing. He bought the general store first, then the grain warehouse by the dock, then the ice house, and within a year he controlled nearly every point of commerce that connected Caramere to the inland towns. People did not object at first. Hobart kept prices fair, hired local men, and spoke about the future of the town with a conviction that made people believe he actually cared about it. He opened a pilotage service, offering to guide ships through the channel for a fee, and he convinced the town council that the service was necessary, that the channel was treacherous, that ships were getting larger and the old ways of navigating by memory and landmark were no longer safe. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like progress. And it was the beginning of the end. What no one outside Hobart's inner circle knew, what no one could have known without the kind of careful, patient observation that Della Taverner had taught her daughter, was that Hobart's men were quietly, systematically moving the channel markers. Not by much. A few degrees here, a few feet there, shifted in the fog of early morning when no one was watching. But the channel into Caramere harbor was narrow, and the shoals on either side were unforgiving, and a few degrees was enough. Ships that did not hire Hobart's pilots began running aground. Not every time, not every ship, but often enough to make the point. Captains who had navigated the channel for years suddenly found their bearings off, their depths wrong, their familiar routes leading them onto rocks that should not have been there. The insurance rates went up. The shipping lines began routing elsewhere. And Hobart's pilotage service, conveniently, never lost a vessel. Captain Augustine Taverner was the first to say it aloud. He stood up at a town meeting in the autumn of 1878 and told the room that the channel markers had been moved, that he had compared the current positions against the original Coast Survey charts and found discrepancies in 7 of the 12 markers, and that he believed Silas Hobart was responsible. The room went quiet. Hobart, who was sitting in the front row, stood up slowly, adjusted his coat, and said, with the calm, wounded voice of a man falsely accused, that Captain Taverner was an aging sailor who could not accept that the world was changing, that the markers had been adjusted by the County Harbor Commission to reflect updated hydrographic data, and that if Captain Taverner had evidence, he should take it to the county commissioner, Aldous Pratt, rather than making accusations in a public forum. It was a deft performance, and it worked, because Aldous Pratt was a man Hobart had been cultivating for 2 years with favors and loans and quiet promises, and when Augustine took his charts to Pratt's office, he was told that the county had no record of any marker tampering and that the matter was closed. Then Hobart did what men like Hobart always do when someone stands in their way. He did not threaten Augustine directly. He did not need to. Instead, he called in every debt the Taverner shipping business carried, the dock fees, the warehouse leases, the supply credits, all of which now flowed through Hobart's holdings, and he produced documents showing that the Taverners owed far more than they actually did, documents with signatures that had been forged or altered, amounts that had been inflated, interest charges that had been invented from nothing. When Augustine protested, Hobart's lawyer, a smooth young man from Bangor, presented the paperwork to the county court, and the court, presided over by a judge who owed Hobart a considerable personal debt, ruled in Hobart's favor. The Taverner house, the dock, the warehouse, the remaining schooner, all of it was seized. Augustine Taverner, a man who had spent 40 years building something honest in a town he loved, was handed a piece of paper telling him he owned nothing, and something inside him broke. He died 3 months later, not from any specific illness but from the slow, quiet collapse of a man who has been told that everything he built belongs to someone else. Della lasted only weeks longer. She had been holding on for Augustine, and when he was gone, she let go, and Lenore was left alone in a rented room above the chandlery with a trunk of clothes, her mother's old surveying tools, and the knowledge that the world she had grown up in had been stolen from her piece by piece. For the next 12 years, Lenore survived. There is no other word for it. She took in sewing and laundry, she cleaned houses, she scrubbed floors at the inn, and she saved, not much, not fast, but steadily, coin by coin, in a tin she kept hidden under a loose board in her rented room. She watched Hobart consolidate his hold on Carrowmere. She watched the independent fishermen slowly give up, sell their boats, or move away. She watched the harbor grow quieter each year, the shipping traffic reduced to Hobart's own vessels and the few ships willing to pay his pilotage fees. She watched the Gallows Point Lighthouse fall into disrepair after it was decommissioned in 1881, condemned, Hobart said, as structurally unsound, though Lenore had walked past it many times and seen nothing wrong with the stone that a few years of maintenance would not fix. She watched Ezra Caulfield leave town in disgrace, labeled a drunkard and a negligent keeper, though every person who knew the man knew that he had never touched liquor in his life. She watched, and she remembered, and she waited, because Della Taverner had taught her daughter that the truth always leaves traces, and that the patient observer will eventually find them. The auction was held on a gray Saturday in October of 1893, in the county courthouse 20 miles up the coast, and it was a sorry affair, a collection of abandoned properties that the county had seized for unpaid taxes, offered to the highest bidder with the enthusiasm of a man selling rotten fish. Lenore had taken the stagecoach alone, wearing her mother's coat with the $60 folded into the lining, and she sat in the back row and waited. The properties went quickly, empty lots, derelict barns, a foreclosed farmhouse, and then the auctioneer reached Lot 14, the Gallows Point Lighthouse and the rocky point on which it stood, and the room went quiet for a different reason. The auctioneer read the description in a flat voice: decommissioned structure, no utilities, structural condition unknown, access by footpath only, and starting bid at $30. No one bid. The auctioneer looked around the room, cleared his throat, and said he felt obligated to mention that the county had assessed the property as essentially worthless, that the tower was likely beyond repair, and that whoever bought it would be assuming responsibility for a structure that would probably cost more to demolish than it was worth. Still no one bid. And then Lenore stood up in the back of the room and said, $45, in a voice so steady and clear that every head in the room turned. The auctioneer blinked, looked for a competing bid, found none, and brought down the gavel. Sold. $45 for a lighthouse that had once been the beating heart of Carrowmere Harbor. She walked the 11 miles back from the courthouse to Carrowmere along the coastal road, carrying the deed in her pocket and the mocking laughter of the auction room still ringing in her ears. She had heard it all, the snickers when she stood up, the muttered comments about a woman buying a pile of rocks, the man behind her who had said, just loudly enough for her to hear, that the fool probably thought she could light it up again and play house in a tower. She did not respond. She had learned long ago that responding to mockery only fed it, and besides, she had not bought the lighthouse for the reason they thought. She had bought it because of the wall. She had noticed it years ago, on one of her evening walks along the point, the way the inner wall of the spiral staircase, on the third turn up from the base, had a section of stone that did not match the rest. The blocks were the same granite, the same size, but the mortar between them was a different color, a slightly lighter gray, as though it had been mixed at a different time and applied in haste by someone who knew what they were doing but did not have the luxury of doing it perfectly. To most people, it would have been invisible. To Lenore, who had been raised by a woman who could spot a 1-degree discrepancy in a survey line from 50 paces, it was a sign that someone had opened that wall, placed something inside, and sealed it back up. She had thought about it for 12 years, turning it over in her mind the way her mother had taught her to turn over a problem, slowly, patiently, from every angle, and when she saw the lighthouse on the auction list, she understood that this was her chance. The first night in the lighthouse was cold and damp and smelled of salt and decay. The windows were cracked, the ironwork rusted, the floor of the watchroom buckled where rain had been coming in for years through a gap in the lantern housing. But the structure itself, the granite blocks, the spiral stair, the walls, was sound, and Lenore knew it. She set down her trunk, lit a lantern, and climbed the spiral staircase slowly, running her hand along the inner wall the way a blind person reads a face. She found it on the third turn, the section of newer mortar, about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, set into the wall with a carelessness that was itself a kind of signature, because it said clearly, "I was here, I was in a hurry, and I did not want anyone to know." She tapped it with the heel of her hand and heard, beneath the granite, the hollow sound of empty space. She did not open it that night. She sat down on the stairs, her lantern casting a wavering circle of light on the curved wall, and she thought about who might have sealed something behind that stone and why. She thought about Ezra Caulfield, the keeper who had been labeled a drunkard and chased out of town, and she thought about the way he had kept his logbook, steady, meticulous, devoted, the work of a man who understood that records mattered, that the truth needed to be written down and preserved even when, especially when, no one wanted to hear it. She thought about her father, standing up in that town meeting with his charts and his evidence, and about the way Hobart had looked at him, not with anger but with the cold, flat patience of a man who already knew how the story would end. And she thought about her mother, who had always said that the most important thing a person could do was to look closely at what everyone else had decided to ignore. She opened the wall the next morning, working carefully with a chisel and a hammer borrowed from the inn's toolshed, chipping out the mortar one piece at a time until the stones came free and she could see into the space behind them. It was a cavity about 2 feet deep and 3 feet tall, lined with oilcloth that had been folded and tucked to keep out the moisture, and inside the oilcloth were 3 items, a leather-bound journal, a rolled bundle of papers tied with tarred twine, and a sealed envelope addressed in a careful, old-fashioned hand to whosoever finds this, and I pray someone does. Lenore sat on the stairs with the journal in her lap and read for the rest of the morning, and what she read made her hands shake, not with fear, but with the slow, deep recognition of a truth she had suspected for years finally confirmed in ink on paper. The journal was Ezra Caulfield's, and it covered the last 3 years of his tenure at Gallows Point, from 1878 to 1881. In it, Caulfield documented everything he had observed from the watchroom of the lighthouse, the night movements of Hobart's boats, the shifting positions of the channel markers, the ships that ran aground and the conditions at the time, the correspondence he had sent to the Lighthouse Board in Washington reporting the marker tampering and requesting an investigation. He had drawn charts of his own, meticulous and precise, showing the original positions of the markers as they had been when he first came to the lighthouse 30 years before, and the positions they had been moved to, with dates and observations recorded in the same steady hand that had kept the lighthouse log for 3 decades. He wrote about watching Hobart's men work in the hours before dawn, their lanterns bobbing on the water as they lifted the markers from their moorings and resettled them in positions that would send any ship following the old route straight onto the shoals. He wrote about the night the Esther May went aground in March of 1879, a coastal freighter carrying grain from Portland, and how he had watched from the lantern room as the ship's crew struggled in the freezing water, and how 2 men had drowned before the shore boats could reach them. He wrote about the guilt he felt, the sleepless nights, the growing conviction that the light he kept was no longer enough, that the markers were being moved inside the very channel his light was supposed to protect, and that the men doing it were doing it with the precision and patience of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly who they were doing it for. The rolled papers were even more damning. They were original hydrographic surveys of the Caromere Channel, commissioned by the Coast Survey in 1869 and stamped with the official seal, showing the exact positions and depths of the channel as it had been surveyed and marked by the federal government. Caulfield had apparently taken them from the lighthouse's reference files before Hobart's people could destroy them, and they were the proof, irrefutable, federal, bearing the weight of the United States government, that the channel markers in Caromere Harbor had been deliberately and systematically moved from their proper positions. Next to them, Caulfield had placed a set of his own hand-drawn comparison charts, each one dated and annotated, showing the original 1869 positions alongside the positions as he had observed them being shifted month by month, year by year, until the channel was a trap. The sealed envelope contained a letter, 6 pages long, in which Caulfield laid out the entire story, how he had discovered the marker tampering, how he had reported it to Aldous Pratt and been ignored, how he had written to the Lighthouse Board 3 times and received no reply, how he had begun to fear for his safety when Hobart's men started watching the lighthouse at night, and how he had finally decided to seal his evidence in the wall of the tower, the one place Hobart would never think to look, because Hobart considered the lighthouse worthless, in the hope that someday, someone would find it and carry the truth to the people who could act on it. He wrote about Augustine Taverner, about the town meeting, about the way Hobart had destroyed the taverners, the way he destroyed everyone who challenged him, not with violence but with paper, with documents, with the slow, grinding machinery of a legal system that Hobart had learned to operate like a press. And then, in the last paragraph, Caulfield wrote, "I am an old man, and I have spent my life keeping a light for others. I cannot keep this light hidden much longer. If you are reading this, the light is yours now. Carry it." Lenore closed the journal, rolled the surveys back into their oilcloth, and sat in the cold light of the lighthouse watchroom for a long time, looking out over the harbor where her father's ships had once come and gone, where her husband's lobster boat had once worked the water, where the channel markers now sat in their wrong positions like a row of lies told in plain sight. She did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of what she was holding, the weight of one man's patience, one man's faith that the truth would eventually be found, and she understood that what she did next would matter not just for her but for every person in Carrowmere who had been pushed aside, priced out, and forgotten. She did not go to Aldous Pratt. She knew better. Pratt was Hobart's man, had been for years, and any evidence brought to him would disappear the way Caulfield's letters to the Lighthouse Board had disappeared. She did not go to the county court, which had already shown itself willing to rubber-stamp whatever Hobart put in front of it. Instead, she went to the people who remembered, the old fishermen who had worked the water before Hobart came, the widows of the men who had died on the shoals, the families who had lost their boats and their livelihoods to a harbor that had been deliberately made treacherous. She went to Tobias Vane, a retired lobsterman who had fished the Carrowmere Channel for 50 years and who could still, from memory, describe the exact position of every marker as it had been when he was a young man. She showed him Caulfield's charts and the 1869 Federal Survey, and the old man ran his thick, scarred fingers over the paper and nodded slowly and said, in a voice thick with something between grief and rage, that he had known it, he had always known it, but no one had ever listened. She went to Mercy Calloway, whose husband's schooner had gone aground on the moved markers in 1879, the same wreck Caulfield had watched from the lantern room, and who had spent the years since wondering why a channel she had navigated 100 times had suddenly turned against her. She went to Felix Orr, a young fisherman who had been thinking about leaving Carrowmere because there was nothing left for him there, and she showed him the evidence and watched his face change from skepticism to shock to a slow, burning recognition of what had been done to them all. The word spread the way truth always spreads in a small town, quietly at first, through kitchen conversations and dockside whispers, then louder, as more people saw the evidence and understood what it meant. But so did the word that Lenore was causing trouble, and it reached Silas Hobart within a week. Hobart came to the lighthouse on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a fine carriage with a driver and a clerk, and he stood at the base of the tower in his good coat and his city shoes and called up to Lenore, who was working on the watchroom floor. He offered to buy the lighthouse from her. He offered $100, then $300, then $5. When she refused, his voice changed, the smooth, reasonable tone fell away, and what was underneath it was something colder and harder, the voice of a man who had been obeyed for too long to accept being told no. He told her that the lighthouse was condemned, that the county could seize it back at any time, that she had no right to be poking around in its walls and spreading stories that could get her into serious trouble. He told her that the channel markers had been adjusted by the county for safety reasons, that the surveys she claimed to have were probably forgeries, and that if she continued to make accusations against respectable businessmen, she would find herself in a court of law facing charges of slander and criminal trespass. He told her he knew where she slept, and that a woman alone in a ruin at the end of a rocky point should think carefully about who she made enemies of. He left without waiting for a reply, and that night, Lenore heard boots on the rocks outside the lighthouse and saw the shapes of men moving in the dark, and she knew that Hobart was not going to wait for the courts to settle this. She barricaded the door and sat through the night with a lantern in one hand and a hammer in the other, and she listened to the men outside testing the door, circling the tower, talking in low voices about whether to break in or wait, and then, just before dawn, leaving. She did not sleep. She worked faster. She copied Caulfield's charts by hand, making 3 sets, and she gave one to Tobias Vane and one to Mercy Calloway and kept one for herself. She wrote a letter to the United States Lighthouse Board in Washington, D.C., enclosing copies of Caulfield's correspondence and a summary of his findings, and she gave the letter to Felix Orr, who was sailing his small sloop to Gloucester the next morning to sell a catch of cod, with instructions to post it from Gloucester so that it could not be intercepted by anyone in Carrowmere or the county post office, which Hobart had been known to read through when it suited him. She told Felix what the letter contained and what it might mean, and the young fisherman looked at her with an expression she had not seen on a young person's face in Carrowmere for a long time, hope, raw and unguarded, the kind that hurts because it has been gone so long you forgot what it felt like. What happened next happened the way things always happen in stories like this, not all at once, but in a series of moments that built on each other until the weight of them became unstoppable. Felix Orr posted the letter in Gloucester. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived in Carrowmere, not through the county post, which Hobart controlled, but by private courier, from the office of the Inspector of the Lighthouse Service, informing the Carrowmere Town Council that a federal inspector would be arriving within the month to examine the condition of the Gallows Point Lighthouse and to investigate the allegations of channel marker tampering that had been brought to the board's attention. Hobart saw the letter before anyone else, because Aldous Pratt brought it to him, and for the first time in 20 years, the mask slipped. He demanded that Pratt destroy the letter. Pratt refused, not out of courage but out of fear, because a letter from the federal government was not a piece of county paperwork that could be buried, and Pratt understood, in the way that small men suddenly understand large consequences, that the ground beneath him was shifting. The inspector arrived on a coasting steamer in the second week of November, a thin, methodical man named Captain Hollowell who carried a leather case full of surveying instruments and the kind of authority that does not need to raise its voice. Lenore met him at the dock with Caulfield's journal, the original surveys, and the wall cavity still open for inspection. Captain Hollowell spent 3 days in Carrowmere. He examined the surveys and compared them to the current marker positions. He interviewed Tobias Vane, who described from memory the original positions and confirmed, point by point, that they matched the 1869 survey. He interviewed Mercy Calloway, who told him about her husband's wreck on a channel she had known for 20 years. He walked the channel at low tide with his instruments and came back to the lighthouse with measurements that confirmed what Lenore already knew, that 7 of the 12 markers had been moved, some by as much as 40 feet, in a deliberate pattern designed to funnel ships onto the shoals unless they were guided by someone who knew the altered route. On the 4th day, Captain Hollowell sat in the lighthouse watchroom with Lenore and told her that the evidence was sufficient to warrant federal charges, that tampering with navigational aids was a crime under United States maritime law, punishable by imprisonment, and that the chain of evidence led directly to Silas Hobart and his pilotage operation. He told her that the Lighthouse Board would be recommending the immediate recommissioning of the Gallows Point Lighthouse, and that if she was willing, they would be honored to have her as its keeper. Lenore looked out the watchroom window at the harbor she had grown up beside, the harbor that had taken her husband and her father and her mother and nearly everything she had, and she said yes. Not with triumph. Not with the satisfaction of a wrong finally righted. But with the quiet, steady resolve of a woman who had been waiting for 12 years to do the one thing she was always meant to do. Silas Hobart was arrested by federal marshals on a cold morning in December, and the town of Carrowmere watched him being led to the dock in handcuffs, and no one cheered, because that was not the kind of town Carrowmere was, but no one looked away either. Aldous Pratt resigned his office the same week and left town before the county could investigate his role. Hobart's holdings were seized by the court, his pilotage service dissolved, his network of favors and debts and forged documents unraveled in a federal courtroom in Portland where the jurors looked at the surveys and the journal and the testimony of a retired lobsterman and a seamstress and a lighthouse keeper's daughter, and they returned a guilty verdict in less than 2 hours. The channel markers were reset to their original positions by a coast survey team in the spring of 1894, and the first ship to navigate the corrected channel, a Portland freighter carrying grain and lumber, came through without a pilot, without a fee, without fear, guided only by the markers and the light. The Gallows Point Lighthouse was relit on a clear evening in May, its Fresnel lens cleaned and polished and turned by a freshly serviced clockwork mechanism, its light sweeping out over the water for the first time in 13 years. Lenore stood in the watchroom and watched the beam move across the dark harbor, and she thought about Ezra Caulfield, wherever he was, and about her father, and her mother, and Corwin, and all the people who had been lost to a lie told in moved stones and altered depths. She thought about the wall, the oilcloth, the journal, the letter that said, "If you are reading this, the light is yours now. Carry it." And she understood that carrying the light was not just about keeping a lantern burning in a tower. It was about carrying the truth when everyone else had decided it was easier to look away. It was about trusting that the small, patient act of paying attention, of noticing the mortar that was the wrong color, of measuring the marker that was in the wrong place, of writing down what you saw even when no one was listening, was enough. It was always enough. And so we come back to the beginning, to the woman with $60 and a crumbling lighthouse and a wall that did not quite match the rest. Lenore Taverner was 33 years old when she bought the Gallows Point light, and the people of Caromere called her a fool, and they were wrong in the way that people are always wrong when they mistake silence for ignorance and patience for weakness. She did not buy the lighthouse because she wanted a home. She did not open the wall because she was looking for treasure. She opened it because she had been raised by a woman who taught her to look closely at what everyone else ignored, and because she carried, in the place where her grief lived, the unshakable conviction that the truth does not disappear just because powerful men want it to. What was behind that spiral wall was not gold or silver or any of the things the world calls valuable. It was a record, careful, meticulous, preserved in oilcloth and stone by a man who understood that the most important light he would ever keep was the one he hid in the dark. Lenore found it. She carried it. And the town that had been dying for 20 years began, slowly, to live again. That is the meaning of what she did. Not revenge. Not justice, though justice came. But restoration, the quiet, patient work of putting things back where they belonged, of turning the light on again, of trusting that the truth, once found, would do what the truth always does if you give it enough time and enough light. That was Lenore Taverner. That was the lighthouse. That was the wall. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for sitting with this story the way Lenore sat with hers, patiently, attentively, all the way through. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments, what is a time you found value in something others had written off? We would love to know. Until next time, stay close.